before we fully launch into the notes, I want to remind you of our objectives for the day, which are to identify biotic factors in ecosystems. So we're going to learn what a biotic factor is, and then you're going to be able to identify them. And we're going to explain the relationship between species, populations, and communities. And then you're going to be able to describe for me an ecosystem with a high level of diversity and an ecosystem with a low level of diversity. We touched on that some in the lab yesterday, so we're just going to clarify it for anybody that missed it, and then we should be good to go. All right? So, ecosystems can be defined as the interactions of all living organisms with the non-living factors in an area powered by the flow of energy. So to simplify, everything that is living and non-living in one area and how it interacts with each other. The flow of energy portion is just talking about the fact that, we have plants that get energy from the sun, and then animals eat those plants, and then other animals eat those animals, and energy moves through that system. So when we're looking at all those different ways that those living and non-living things interact, we're looking at an ecosystem. Living things in an ecosystem, we call living things biotic factors. So when you hear me talk about something as a biotic factor, you know that that thing is a living thing. So to go back to our objectives for today, if I was to ask you to identify biotic factors in an ecosystem, you would need to point out to me all the things that are living. It's as simple as that. They can be classified into a couple of different categories, okay? The first category that we often put them in is a species. This is a group of closely related organisms that are able to breed and produce fertile offspring, okay? The fertile offspring part sounds like an add-on, but it is an important piece, okay? If you have organisms from the same species, they should be able to reproduce, and then those offspring should also be able to reproduce. Okay, so lions and I believe they do lions and tigers together to make a liger, right? And that you are able to produce a lion, and a lion and a tiger can mate to make a liger, but then that liger isn't going to be able to reproduce because they are not from the same species. Yes. The idea here is that could you theoretically breed organisms that are from different species and have the offspring survive? Yes, but that doesn't make them part of the same species because those offspring would be mutated and they would not be fully functional organisms that could then reproduce. So we would not consider them from the same species. Only creatures from the same species that can reproduce and have offspring that can then reproduce qualify. So think about a dog and a dog, right? Then we have a population. So if I'm looking at an area, a population is all the organisms of one species that are in that area. So if I went out and I said, let's say Creighton is the ecosystem that I'm looking at, a population of squirrels would be all of the squirrels in Creighton. If Creighton is our ecosystem, then a population is all the organisms of one species. So you can have a population of spruce trees, and that would be all the spruce trees in that ecosystem. You can have a population of humans, right? And in fact, we actually take data on this and report it on the sign outside of Creighton to say what the population of Creighton is, and they are referencing the population of human beings that live in Creighton. All the organisms of the human species that live in Creighton are counted towards that. If we want to talk about more than one population, okay, then we start talking about a community. All the different populations in an ecosystem and how they interact, that's going to be a community. So if we're talking about the way that spruce trees and squirrels interact, we're talking about a community. If we're talking about the way that humans and fish in Creighton interact, we're talking about a community. What separates a community from being an ecosystem is that the community only represents all the biotic portions of an ecosystem. So if you're looking at a community, it's only showing you the interactions of things that are living. It doesn't include any interactions with things that are non-living. So a community is all of those different living factors and how they're interacting inside the ecosystem. Ecosystems vary or are different in two main ways. The first is in their size, or the space that the ecosystem occupies. You can have large ecosystems, like a rainforest, that can have a size equal to several million square miles. Like the Brazilian rainforest is huge. Or you can have small ecosystems, like if you have an aquarium in your house that you keep fish in, that's an ecosystem, and it might only take up a few square feet. So they can be huge and massive, or they can be very small. And as we learned yesterday, ecosystems can also vary in their diversity. This is a measure of the number of species that dwell in an ecosystem. So if we're measuring diversity, we're measuring how many different separate species are there in an area. Diverse ecosystems, like a coral reef, can have thousands of species of fish, thousands of species of invertebrates, thousands of species of plants, and other things that I may not even be thinking about. So they have a ton of different species in them. And they may not have a ton of each species, right? They might not have, 100,000 of each species, but they have lots of different species in them. And then we have low diversity ecosystems. An easy one here to think about is a desert. They have a few key species, and there's a lot of each of those species, but then there's only a few hundred of each other species, and there's just not a lot of other types of species. You will have much less diversity. Now, an ecosystem, or a desert ecosystem, doesn't have no diversity. It has some diversity. It's just not on the level of, say, a rainforest or a coral reef. We're going to watch this video all about the human impact on biodiversity. So, there were some important consequences of humans living in the world, and some of those are unavoidable, right? Some things can't be avoided if we want humans to survive. However, it's important to look at them and think about them and see how we can minimize them, because if we destroy the planet, we also won't survive, right? So, nope, I don't want you to play again. I want to go to the next slide. Thank you very much. Okay. Ecosystems that have been urbanized, or that have had large amounts of human impact on them, tend to have less biodiversity, and there's some causes of that, okay? Destruction of habitats. Whether we like it or not, when we build new houses, places, when we build new parking lots, when we build new businesses, when we build new roads, and even when we develop new farmland, it reduces the number of wild habitats for populations living in that ecosystem. So there is some destruction of habitats anytime humans move into an area. Introduction of invasive species. They talked about this very briefly in the video, but anytime you bring a species from one location to an area where it has no natural predators, that species tends to take over that area, and it will outcompete and outsurvive other species, causing them to starve out, and then we reduce the total number of species in that area, therefore reducing biodiversity. And also, they touched on pollution, okay? Anytime we are putting harmful things into the atmosphere, into the soil, into the water, we are damaging environments and reducing the number of species that can live in that area. Not everybody plays a huge role in this, but everybody plays some role, and it's good to be informed in terms of how you're affecting your environment.